All right, so today we're in part 53 of the Heart of the Matter. This is still in the book of Ephesians, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. I know usually with the Heart of the Matter teaching, I will do like a quick review from maybe the previous parts, but in going through my putting the teaching together for this week, I really felt like the Ruach wanted me to go back into chapter 2 and to really kind of in a much more deep or clear way, explain or clarify what I call the Ephesians 2 process. Okay, I really felt like that needed to be done. So if that's okay with you, we're going to go back now into chapter 2. We're really basically up to chapter 3, but I want to get to chapter 2, and I want to kind of re-clarify this process. Okay, so in Ephesians chapter 2, okay, we're going to just kind of go through this process real quickly. In verses 1 and 2, we were told that and I'm going to read this in the, it's talking like I'm speaking to you or speaking with you here, that we were told that we were dead in our trespasses, right? Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, we were dead in our trespasses and sins. So that's what we started out. We're dead in trespasses in which we once walked. According to the world and HOSEA, I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. It says, that's the process or the path that we were following. And then we're also told that this is the spirit that was working in us and caused us to be sons of disobedience. Okay, that's kind of my paraphrase of verses 1 and 2, that the process starts with understanding that you start out that you are dead because of your trespasses, because you're sinning. Of course, you don't even know that you're sinning most of the time, because if you didn't know about what actually defines sin, you're just doing what you're doing. Because you're walking according to the way the world sees things, through the filter of the world and HOSEA, which, by the way, HOSEA loves to tell you, hey, what you're doing is great, even when it's not, or especially when it's not. And so here we are, we were dead in our trespasses when we once walked a certain type of walk. Because you have to get this perspective as we go through the chapter to understand this process. And because Paul isn't just teaching different ideas here, he's just explaining a process. And so I want us to understand that, because some of the verses that are cherry-picked out that cause so much trouble for those of us of the Torah observant community, they're not in the context of the process. They're not understanding how they fit into the process. So then we get to verse 3 through 5, and we're told that in this state, what state? The state where we were once walking in this way, we were in our trespasses, walking according to the world, that in that state we lived in our lusts of our flesh, and we were doing the desires of the flesh. So while we're in this state, being disobedient sons and just kind of walking according to the world and HOSEA, what that looks like is doing what's right in our own eyes. We're walking in the lusts of our own flesh, our own desires. Now, what trips us up is the word lusts, because you're thinking, well, I don't lust. And so let's take that word out, because that kind of messes us up. What it simply means is you were doing what you wanted to do. Let's change that to doing what's right in your own eyes. So, because let's face it, even when you lust after something, you will then lie to yourself, or rational lies to yourself, that it's the right thing to do, or it's okay. So here we are, we're in this state, and what we're doing is we're basically doing whatever we want to do, to the best that we think we should be doing it according to the standards of the world and the things that are the wrong measuring sticks or the wrong parameters, right? And so while we're in this state, Elohim, now going into verse 5, he made us alive together with Messiah. So even while we were in this state, he gave us this opportunity to provide an opportunity to life, because when we were in our sins, we were dead, right? So we're getting this process that here, remember, we start off, we're dead. Not dead meaning we're like, zombies or something, but meaning that there was no future. It was just now, and that was it. And so we didn't know we were walking dead, that there was no future but death. He says, but even in that state, Messiah provided us with life, or at least an opportunity for life. While in this state, Elohim made us alive together in Messiah. Now, verse 11 through 12, we're going to just skip a little bit here. In verse 11 through 12, he says, we ought to remember that we were once Gentiles. So now we're going to go back, and he said, look, don't forget the state you were in. You were Gentiles. And how do you know you were a Gentile? Because somebody say, well, I was a Jew, or I was this. No. Gentile is meaning outside the camp. You can still be a Jew and be outside the camp. You could be any of the 12 tribes and be outside the camp. What makes the designation of in or outside the camp? Well, what makes the designation is you are designated by your actions. In other words, what you are actually covenanted to. Are you covenanted to the world, or are you covenanted to the covenant of Abba that was given at Mount Sinai? And so what we have is this idea of, don't forget that you were, either by birth or by action, you were Gentiles. You were acting like, or you actually were, of the nations. And so this is very important. This is why when we do the mikvah, one of the things that I have people declare is that they're giving up all citizenships and attachments and submission under the authorities of HOSEA and the world, and sovereignty even over ourselves. And then we then come under the authority of Elohim, and then we are also coming under the covenant, and then we're also coming under the obligations of citizenship. And so that's the difference between being inside the camp and outside the camp. And so let's not get too hung up on this, Jew and Gentile thing, because we're going to see this come up again over and over again in Paul's writings. He might use a metaphor like those who were born of the circumcision, those of the uncircumcision. We covered that when we were in Romans, if you remember. Okay? But this contrast really has to do with choice. And so here he's saying, look, do not forget that while you were doing all these things, you were Gentiles. You were outside the camp. And when you were outside the camp, you were without Messiah. You were excluded from the citizenship of Israel. You see, that's exactly what I've been trying to say to you. Inside the camp, you're a citizen. Outside the camp, you're just part of the nations. This book describes two groups, Israel and everybody else. That's all it describes. Now, it may have names for different parts of the everybody else's, the this-ites or the that-ites or whatever, but it's really basically just two groups, Israel and everybody else. But the book also, and right here in this chapter, talks about how you can go from everybody else to being Israel. How do you go from outside to inside? So Paul's trying to explain this to the Ephesians. Okay, so here we were. Now we're going back to verse 1 and 2, remembering that we were once those people. We were dead in trespasses. We were goyim. We were Gentiles. He says, don't forget that, because when you were Gentiles, remember this is going into verse 11 and verse 12. Verse 12 says that at that time you were without Messiah, excluded from the citizenship. Okay, let's understand that based on this verse, there is no such thing as a Gentile believer. Okay? If you are a believer, you are Israel. Because if you're a believer, according to Yaakov, according to James, your actions will manifest out to demonstrate your belief. You're going to walk in such a way. Now, we're contrasting the walk. In verse 2, they're walking in accordance to the world and HOSEA. When you choose to walk in accordance to Elohim, now that walk is the difference, that shows what you believe. And so if you are walking the walk and you are, quote unquote, a believer, then you're Israel, not Goyim. So that's one of these lies that's confusing the body, that somehow, well, I'm a Gentile believer. Well, it's an oxymoron. There's no such thing. There's actually no such thing as a Gentile believer. If you became a believer, you've changed from Gentile to Israel. And hopefully people can see that. It doesn't mean you went through a formal conversion process. There was a mixed multitude at Sinai. When they all left, they were all Israel. Why? Because they covenanted. What did they covenant? In Exodus 19, Yahweh says, if you agree to do everything, if you do everything at my voice, if you do everything you hear out of my mouth, I will take you as my people. Citizenship. Okay? And I will hold you up above all nations. You'll be a nation, a kingdom of priests. But you got to obey. You got to obey everything that comes out of my mouth, he says. If you do everything according to my voice. And so here we go. We're looking at 11 and 12. So now, let's understand. So because of the way we used to walk, we have to never forget that we were Gentiles. And as Gentiles, we didn't have Messiah. We were excluded. That's a really strong word. Excluded from citizenship. There is no bending that line. If you are Goyim, you cannot be a citizen. You must change your citizenship. You can't come in and say, I'm going to stay Goyim, and yet you should accept me as a citizen. In other words, you can't come in and keep walking that Gentile way, okay, the nation's way, doing whatever the nations do. He says, as in, kind of in that mind, in that state where we were also strangers to the covenants of promise. It's all in verse 12. We were excluded from citizenship because we were strangers to the covenants. Because the covenant is what makes you a citizen. Are we understanding this? The covenant is what makes you a citizen. So when you were outside the camp, you didn't know about the covenants. You were a stranger to the covenants. And so therefore, you didn't have what's next. He says there was no expectation. We had no expectation and were without Elohim. Because without the covenants, what expectation could you have? The covenant gives you, he tells you, I expect from you, and then you can expect from him. That's what the covenant tells you. You can expect, and then he lays out all this beautiful stuff. You'll chase away nations. One will chase away hundreds and thousands, and nobody will bother you, and there will be no issues for fertility, and there will be no problem with your crops and with your animals, and you'll... Amen? Expectation. So here we are. We were Gentiles. We were without Messiah. We were excluded from citizenship. This is all because we were strangers to the covenants of promise, and we had no expectation then, and we were without Elohim. That's very clear in verse 12. I don't think there's any other way to interpret what Shaul is saying here. Now in verse 11, we're going to jump back because we kind of skipped it a little bit. In verse 11, what he's adding to the context is this. He adds to the context of this issue the enmity between the Jew and the Gentile, referred to as circumcision versus uncircumcision. See, now we're going to deal with this enmity thing. He says, in verse 11, he says, therefore remember that you were once Gentiles in the flesh, you were walking in the flesh, who were called the uncircumcision, or Gentile, by what is called the circumcision, or Jew, made in flesh by hands. So he's simply saying those who were born in the covenant, at this time was generally just the Jewish community, right? Israel was dispersed and long disappeared. He said, just remember that you were once Gentiles, you were once that way, and you were referred to by people in the covenant as being the uncircumcision. And they were referred to as the circumcision. And by the way, the issue here is not circumcision. We've talked about that many times. It's a way of referring to two different groups of people. Those born by bloodline Israel or Judah, and those born outside. Okay? But what we're going to build into here is that there was this enmity between the groups. Because we're trying to understand when we eventually get to verse 15, okay, that why does Christianity generally use that as an excuse to say that the law was the problem? Well, let's understand as this is playing out. So far up to this point, and by the way, I'm going to get to verse 15, and there's going to be a part of it that I'm not going to answer you because I really don't know. We don't know how to work that part of the verse out. What we do know is what it can't be. See, sometimes, and I've taught you this many times, sometimes we don't know what something is, but we know what it can't be. And the way you can do that is context, right? So look what's been going on very consistently for the first 12 verses. You're going through this process of understanding the contrast between when we were Gentiles and walking in a way that led to death, and we were dead in our trespasses. We were outside the covenant. We didn't have Elohim. We didn't have Messiah. We had none of these things. And then we're going to be talking about coming near and how that's going to change all that. Okay? So we're going into now verse 13 through 18. So now in Messiah, we are brought together through his blood. Okay, I'm kind of paraphrasing what's going on here, right? Now in Messiah, we're brought near by the blood. Okay? He is our peace and has made both one by breaking down the barrier between the two. Okay? This is mention of making both one. He is our peace. He has made both one. Both what? If you're making both, there's got to be two of something, because both is not 5, 6, or 8, it's two. What both? Well, could it be that the verse earlier where he talked about circumcision and uncircumcision? So he's saying he made both one. He's talking about those that were citizens and those that were previously excluded from citizenship. He made them both one and brought peace between the two, because can you imagine going back 2,000 years ago and seeing the animosity between the Jew and the Gentile? It's still today. And he's saying, look, but now in Messiah Yeshua, you who were once afar off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. He is our peace. So first of all, he's saying, you who were once afar off. Who? Who's the who? The ones who were dead in trespasses, who were once Gentiles. Those who? And by the way, when he says afar off, it's also referring to the lost Israelites as well, who had basically, essentially become like Gentiles. So he says, look, he's our peace and made both one, having broken down the partition of the barrier. And this is what we don't know exactly what Paul's trying to say here, having abolished in his flesh the enmity. So let's just go that way first. Okay, he abolished in his flesh the enmity. All right, the enmity. And so this is to create to himself a renewed man from the two, thus making peace. So there's two that he's bringing together to make peace. And so there's this enmity thing. Okay? And so what was this enmity? It was the enmity that he destroyed, by the way. It says here that he abolished the enmity. It doesn't say he abolished the law, abolished anything. Now, people want to say that the law was the problem. It was the enmity. No, I don't see that here. Okay, look what it says here. He abolished the enmity. Now, through this abolishing of the enmity, whatever that is, we'll talk about it here in a minute, both groups now have access to the Father through one Spirit. Okay, that's what we see in verse 18. Because through him we both have access, both again, there's that word both, have access to the Father by one. So we're still talking about an issue between two groups, not an issue between two laws. Because he does say that there's an issue between two laws. The law that was trespasses, sin, death, and according to the world, and the law of Yahweh. The law that brings life. The law that's part of the covenant. The law that brings you near. And so we have to understand this in context here as we're going through it. Now let's look at enmity for a second so we can see scripturally when enmity is used. What is it talking about? Because he says here, look, I'm going to just take this Torah of commandments and dogma out for a second, because that's the part we don't understand. That's the part that's used against the law, right? So let's take that out just for a second and read what it's talking about here. It says, he abolished in his flesh the enmity so as to create in himself one renewed man from the two, thus making peace, and to completely restore to favor both of them, the Jew and the Gentile, unto Elohim in one body through the stake, having destroyed the enmity by it. And having come, he brought as good news, peace to you who are far off, and peace to those near. The law of peace, I'm thinking, is really what's going on here, because through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Okay, so that's what's going on here. And by the way, then he says, so then you, remember back to verse 1, you were dead, you were this, you were strangers. Back to verse 12, you were excluded from citizenship. Then in verse 19, you were no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the set-apart ones. Now, what is the set-apart ones? The kadosh, the holy ones. Well, that's talking about being a set-apart nation. And Yahweh says, be set apart as I am set apart. So he says, with the set-apart ones, you're fellow citizens with the set-apart, and members of the household of Elohim. And by the way, this whole thing is built on the foundation of the emissaries, the prophets, Yeshua, Messiah himself being the chief cornerstone. So it doesn't say we tore down the foundation and tore down the building and made a new one. So whatever this is talking about, he says, you are now no longer strangers but fellow citizens because you've been built on a foundation. You've been built on a foundation. The emissaries, the prophets, and Yeshua himself, in whom all the building being joined together grows into a set-apart dwelling place to Yahweh, in whom you are also being built together into a dwelling of Elohim in spirit. Okay, now, let's kind of go back to this enmity thing. Let's go to Genesis chapter 3. Okay, you can hold your place in Ephesians. We're going to go to Bereshit, Genesis chapter 3. Okay, in Genesis. Now, by the way, in the law first mentioned, this is the first place we see the enmity pop up. Okay, which means that we're going to learn a lot about what enmity is all about when we see where it's used first. So in Genesis 3, verse 14, it says, "And Yahweh Elohim said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all livestock and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you are to go and eat dust all the days of your life. And I put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall crush your head, and you shall crush his heel." So he put enmity between Hasatan and the seed that was Yahweh's seed going through Adam. There's enmity between his seed. It says, "I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." So that means that they're at enemies with each other. They have a totally adverse relationship. They're adversaries. And so this enmity thing is talking about something that's an adversary or an enemy. And the enemy's lined up between what? Hasatan and Elohim. Is that not exactly the same thing going on in Ephesians chapter 2? You were once walking according to the world and Hasatan, and now you're going to walk according to Elohim. The enmity was between those two elements, the people of the one with the people of the other. So therefore, the people of the covenanted, quote-unquote, people did not want to let the uncovenanted people in. They didn't want them to become part of the one renewed new man. I mean, you have no idea, not living at that time, to understand the challenge of how the Jews looked at the Gentiles and how the Gentiles looked at the Jews. The animosity, the enmity. You talk about anti-Semitism, you talk about problems. Go back a few thousand years and see what was going on. And here, Shaul is trying to bring a group together in Ephesus where he can help them to understand how to be echad, how to be one. One in Messiah. But it's not Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, still staying Jew and Gentile. It's Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah. Now everybody's Israel. And we're all under covenant. There's a horrible, really terrible teaching out there that comes out of, I won't mention who, but it teaches what they call bilateral ecclesiology. And that bilateral ecclesiology basically says Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, but the Jew has to stay the Jew and the Gentile can stay the Gentile. So it's okay for us to come into Messiah as a Gentile and keep eating pork and keep keeping Christmas and Easter and keep keeping Sunday, keep doing all of that stuff, but yet somehow you're one in Messiah. But the Jews, they need to do the Torah. So now we've got two different laws. But everywhere I read in the Tanakh, it says there is one law for the Israelite as well as for the stranger. And by the way, the stranger there is the one wanting to be Israel. The Hebrew there is ger or garim. Okay, the plural will be garim. And the garim are those who are looking to join. And so if you're looking to join, you have to know that all those rules that the ones who are already joined have to keep, those are now going to be for me too. And so while I'm a garim, those laws actually apply to me while even in that state. I'm supposed to already be walking in that as I'm preparing to commit to citizenship. So here we go. The very first mention was there in Genesis 3. So we see this enmity is between two different ways of seeing the whole world. Two different lifestyles, two different ways of walking. One that trusts and believes Yah, the other that says, did Yahweh really say? Did he really mean that? The one that questions and doubts and wants to kind of do, oh, she looked at the fruit and saw it looked good and good to eat and, could give me knowledge and wisdom. See, that's what we do is we try to justify. Well, then we say things like, well, Yahweh wouldn't want me not to have that. After all, that's good things. He would want me to have that, wouldn't he? And then we spin and spin until the next thing you know, we don't look like an Israelite anymore. Let's go to HOSEA chapter 9. Okay, we're still looking at enmity. It only appears in the scriptures just a few times. Okay, and we're going to look at almost all of them. There's one other place where it's just talking about literally enmity between two tribes and things, so two nations. But here is more that has to deal with Yahweh. So in HOSEA, all right, in HOSEA chapter 9, okay, in HOSEA chapter 9, I'm going to read verses 7 through 10. Okay, HOSEA 9. The days of punishment have come. The days of retribution have come. Yisrael knows. The prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad because of the greatness of your crookedness, and great is the enmity. Okay, let's hold on there for a second. So first of all, the days of punishment have come, whatever time frame this is talking about. Yisrael knows. The real prophet is looked at as a fool, or the fake prophet really is a fool, whichever way you want to look at that. And the man, quote unquote, the man of the spirit is mad. People are thinking that the man who is really of the spirit is mad, or see, we don't know how to interpret this yet, or it's saying the one who's truly claiming to be of the spirit, he actually is mad. Because we have a lot of people out there that we know are mad who claim to be flowing in the spirit. Okay? So this is going crazy here. Then it says, but great is this enmity. And now to be clear, he says, Elohim's watchman over you, Ephraim, is the prophet, but a trapper's snare is in all of his ways. Enmity is in the house of Elohim. So there's this enmity that goes back to Genesis chapter 3, that in the house of Elohim there are those that have chosen the wrong path, and those that have chosen the right path, and we have this enmity again. Okay? Same enmity going on here in Hosea chapter 9. Now let's go to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. So you can see why I realized I really needed to go back through Ephesians chapter 2. Okay? Romans chapter 8 and verse 5. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the matters of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the matters of the Spirit. So remember, this is that same mindset problem in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, again, remember he said that if you're in Ephesians chapter 2, he says that you basically walk in the lust of your flesh. You're doing what you want to do. Same thing, it's a mindset. Verse 6, for the mind of the flesh is death. Back to what he said in Ephesians chapter 2, right? Where in our trespasses we have death. But the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. So somehow there's a transference or a change of our minds when we go from death to life, which again was talked about in Ephesians 2, when it said that with Messiah, he has brought us life. But it has to do with a mindset that leads to a heart change, which leads to action change, which leads to destiny change. Or I missed one. Action change, which leads to habits change, which leads to destiny change. And so that destiny shifts from death to life. He says, because the mind of the flesh is enmity towards Elohim. There's your enmity problem. It's not just Jew versus Gentile, it's the mindset. The Gentile mindset is at enmity to Elohim. The spirit mindset, the mindset that you get when he calls you and opens your eyes and opens your ears and opens your heart so that you can receive, that mindset with your default fleshly mindset are at enmity. They fight in war with each other. He says the mind of the flesh is at enmity towards Elohim, for it does not subject itself to the Torah of Elohim, neither indeed is it able. Now remember, this is the same guy that's used to say the law was done away with, you don't need to keep anything. And he's saying, look, the mind of Elohim, it says, is one way, and the enmity that comes from the mind of the flesh the other. He said the mind of the flesh does not subject itself to the Torah of Elohim. So by contrast, we should, I think, logically say that the mind of the Spirit is the one that does subject itself to the Torah of Elohim. I don't think that's a leap that's unreasonable. He said, and those who are in the flesh are unable to please Elohim. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of Elohim dwells in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, this one is not his. Now look, we're trying to now talk about, don't all of a sudden go Pentecostal on me, okay? He didn't just shift from talking about what you do and what you do and what you do to all of a sudden you're off in some ethereal, whatever. He's talking about that when you're in the Spirit, we're going back to verse 6, right? The mind of the flesh is death, but the mind of the Spirit, the way of thinking according to the Spirit, which is the fullness of the intent of how Yahweh intended things to be. That's all it means. It's not some thing that you now have to feel, I have to feel something, I got to hear a voice, I got to That's all your emotionalism that came out of the lies that you were told in the Pentecostal church and the charismatic movement. I'm not attacking you for when you were in there. You were lied to. It's not your fault. Okay, but you were lied to that somehow this emotional-based thing is actually more real than what actually is real. And he's saying, look, if you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, he says, if indeed the fullness of the intent of Elohim dwells in you. Let's just put the fullness of the intent in there. It makes more sense. So in other words, if the fullness of how he intended dwells in you and you would then actually think a certain way, then you'd feel a certain way, then you'd do certain things, then you'd end up in a certain destiny. Your destination would change from death to life. He says, and if Messiah is in you, because now he's telling you that Messiah is that Spirit. Now, who's Messiah? Messiah is not only Yeshua as he was when he came in the flesh, not just the guy who's sitting at the right hand, etc., but Messiah is the truth. He is the way or the path to all of this, like the halakha, what you do. And he is, and leads to life. He's life. We also know that he is the Word. We also know that he's the Word made flesh. We also know that the Word that was made flesh was the Torah. Because we're told in Psalm 119 that the Torah is truth, and Yeshua says, I am the truth. We don't have two truths, one truth. Okay, he's the walking, talking, living Word, living Torah. And so when John's talking about in John 1, everybody understood the Word from Sinai, the Word from above, put on flesh. He's the full embodiment. See, that's what we were told in other verses, that Messiah is the goal of the Torah. In other words, if you keep it, this is what you'll look like. It's the destination, and the way to get there is through the path called the Torah. And it's not about the works. It's about the belief and the trust and the faith and walking it out in the right heart and right mind and right attitude. This is in incorporating the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians, say, 5:22 and 23 into the mix. So you're not just keeping Shabbat, you're keeping Shabbat in love, joy, peace, patience, etc. You're not just keeping kosher, you're doing it with love, joy, peace. You understand what I'm saying? You're doing it in a kind way. A lot of people out there are Torah terrorists. They're taking their Torah and they're beating people in the head with it. Bam! You know? Where's the fruit of the Spirit there? And I've told people often, even if you are technically correct, if you're doing it that way, you're already wrong. I don't care if you were technically right or scripturally right, you're still wrong. Because it has to be Yeshua-like. It has to be in the fullness of the fruit of the Spirit. Continuing in Romans chapter 8. So he goes, let's see. And if, okay, but you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. Okay, then it says, and if Messiah is in you, verse 10, the body is truly dead on account of sin, but the Spirit is life on account of righteousness. Now we're comparing the same two things that were going on in Ephesians chapter 2. Okay, we're comparing what? That which leads to death, the flesh, he goes, the body or the flesh truly dead, but the Spirit is life on account of the ooey gooey spirit thing? Or righteousness? Oh, but wait a minute, you were already sold the bill of goods that you didn't actually have to do anything righteous. He did it all for you, so now you're righteous because of what he did. Okay, so let's see how that works for you. You come to work for me, you work all day, but I'm going to pay him because you did it for him. Does that work for you? I mean, it doesn't make sense on any level except that it makes it sense on your level of saying, hey, because then I don't have to do anything. What a nice, easy path. Okay? He says here, but the Spirit is life on account of righteousness. What's righteousness? Doing what's right. What defines what's right? He does, through the Torah. And if the Spirit of him who raised Yeshua from the dead dwells in you, so now we're saying, and if the fullness of the Father who raised the Son dwells in you, he who raised Messiah from the dead shall also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit dwelling in you, through his mind, through his heart, through his fullness, through his intrinsic nature. We talked about that in the Spirit teaching, right? The understanding the Ruach or the Spirit teaching. So if you have his intrinsic nature dwelling in you, he will also give life to your mortal bodies through that intrinsic nature dwelling in you. So you know what's natural for you. You know what's in your nature to do. And sometimes people may say to you, oh, I thought you did that. And you're looking at them like, that's not even in my nature to do. It may be in other people's nature to do, but that's just not your thing. It's not in your nature to do that. So we know what's in his nature to do. We should understand that in that context. So he's saying, look, he says, so then brothers, now in verse 12, then brothers, we are not debtors to the flesh to live according to the flesh. So he's saying, look, if you think that we are debtors because you were bought with a price, we're not debtors to the flesh to live in the flesh. Even though that's exactly what mainstream Christianity is teaching people. He says, if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. It's not ambiguous. He says, if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit, by the fullness of the intent, by the Spirit of Messiah in you, you put to death the deeds of the body, which is back to you were once Gentiles, dead in your trespasses, walking according. See, tie them together. It's the same thing Paul's saying here to the Romans as he said to the Ephesians. He says, if you indeed, I got to remember where I was here. Indeed, if the Spirit, you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. Now, what do we see here being compared? The deeds of the body and the deeds of the righteousness, the deeds of the Torah, the deeds of the Spirit. But yet we're still swimming upstream against all of those years of teaching saying that somehow the Spirit is something you feel, right? I'll feel it. I had a check in my spirit. You might want to check which spirit that is that you're feeling a check in your spirit. Maybe that's the better check, is check which spirit it is. Because you got three of them for sure. You got the spirit in man, you got the spirit of Elohim, and you got the spirit of Hasatan. And by the way, all of them are voices in your head, so no wonder you guys are all crazy. You got three voices yakking away in your head. Two of them never shut up. The other one's quiet, waiting for the other two to shut up. But your voice and Hasatan's voice, nonstop. Trying to get you to do whatever it is. You ready for this? Trying to get you to do whatever it is you really want to do. They're not putting ideas in your head that are not yours. Stop blaming Hasatan for being the initiator. He's the cheerleader. He's the one telling you, like he told Chava. Well, he didn't say to her, hey, here's a thought for you. Why don't you go eat this fruit? He said, well, did he say that you can't eat of this? And just started to, because he knew she'd seen the tree. He probably knew that she looked over going, I don't really understand why we can't eat that tree. It really looks good. He knew all that, and he was trying to bring that out because guess what? The father needed to know if that was in her. The father needed to know if that was in her. That's you too. He allows Hasatan to mess around with you because he's bringing out what really is already there. Oh, but Christianity wants you to blame Hasatan for everything. Blame demons for everything. They have nothing they can do to you or with you or through you that you don't already have in you. Clean it up and they go away. Don't give them anything. It's like, you know what, people that have like bug problems in their house, it's because they got food lying around all over the place. Guess what? You clean all that up, the bugs go away. Because there's nothing there. It's the same thing. If you don't provide anything for them to use or to work with, they're not going to be there. They'll go find someplace else to get what they want. And so here we have the understanding that it's just simply bringing to the surface what was inside. You don't think for a second that Elohim understood that Adam and Chava needed to be tested to see what was going on inside and to bring that out before he started all the rest of it? And so he allowed Hasatan. Because why? We always like to blame Adam, and he deserves a lot of blame because he was there and he let her do it. But what about Yahweh? How come he's not strolling around keeping this from happening? After all, he created them. He had them together. He brought her out of Adam's rib, the whole thing, because he allowed it to take place. Because it brought to the surface something that needed to be exposed. And we have verses that say nothing will remain hidden. Everything gets brought out and is exposed. Not exposed necessarily in public, but at least to your own awareness so you realize, wait a minute, I actually have that failing. I have that problem. I have that shortcoming. Shortcoming is a great word because it means that you're falling short of some measuring stick, and that measuring stick happens to be Yeshua. And so we have that going on here. So he says, look, it says, and if you, back in verse 10, and if Messiah is in you, the truth is in you, the Torah is in you, the body is truly dead on account of sin, but the Spirit is life on account of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Yeshua from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Messiah from the dead shall also give life to your mortal bodies through this Spirit, through his Spirit dwelling in you. So then, brothers, we are not debtors to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit, by the truth, by the way, by the Spirit of Messiah, doing what he did, you put to death the deeds of the body. And by the way, if you put to death the deeds of the body, Satan and the demons have nothing to work with. And so they'll move on to somebody else. If you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. Not just live, but live in shalom, live in peace, live with joy. He says, for as many as are led by the fullness of the intent of Elohim, the Spirit of Elohim, these are the sons of Elohim. But realize all of this goes back to verse 7 when it talks about the mind of the flesh is enmity to Elohim. So we're trying to also reconcile in Ephesians this fleshly mindset at the beginning of chapter 2 with Yeshua coming into the mix through the chapter, making both into one. What both? How about the two minds you got in your head? Not we're just talking about just Gentiles and Jews. What about reconciling that fleshly mind with the Elohim mind and bringing it into one? Because they were at enmity. In other words, taking one and making it subject to the other. Let's go to James chapter 4. We've got more on this enmity thing. Yaakov, James chapter 4. Okay, James chapter 4, and we're going to begin in verse 1. And I may take it more verses than I just have to see what the Ruach kind of leads here. Okay, we're going to read at least the first 4 verses. So where do fightings and strivings come from among you? And by the way, if Yaakov was alive today, he'd probably be wondering, 2,000 years, guys, and you're still doing this? No difference now. He goes, where do fightings and strivings come from among you? Do they not come from your pleasures that battle in your members? So what is he talking about? This battle in your head and in your heart. He says, look now, he's going to say the same sort of thing as Shaul said. You desire and do not have. You murder and are jealous and are unable to obtain. You strive and fight and you do not possess because you do not ask. But he's talking about the problem is you're going through the fleshly lusts, the fleshly cravings. But he's also telling you that those cravings, that when you give in to them, they still leave you wanting. They don't actually give you what you think you're going to get out of them. You still feel like you need or you want because it didn't actually satisfy the craving. He says, you ask and you do not receive because you ask evilly in order to spend it on your pleasures. So now we're getting see, it's the mind problem. Oh, you're asking for all the wrong reasons because you're still trying to fill verse 2. You're asking because you still want to fulfill all those fleshly thought processes and fleshly desires. So you're asking with an ulterior motive of still feeding the old man that was supposed to be buried and dead. He says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with Elohim? Now he's telling you what's going on here in chapter 4. They're still loving the world. Not loving the world saying, I have mercy and compassion on the people in it. They're loving the ways of the world. They're like Lot's wife looking over the shoulder going, I'm still kind of going to miss that place. Okay? It says, those who put their hand to the plow when turning back are not even fit to be in the kingdom. That's still, and Yeshua said that, and these are his disciples who are taking that understanding and putting it into more context. He's saying, look, this is not going to work. It says you cannot be friends with the world and also with Elohim. There's an adversarial relationship there. You can't be sitting on and straddling the fence. Let's think about it. That's kind of painful. Don't straddle the fence. Get on one side or the other. That's the old lukewarm thing. I wish you were hot or cold, because then I could work with you. The problem when you're lukewarm is you think you're on the hot side of the fence when you're on the cold side also. And he's like, if you are all on the cold, I can wake you up and say, hey, wake up. You're on the wrong side of the fence. But see, if you already think you're on the right side of the fence, it's hard because you're sort of partially on that side already, but not enough, not all the way. So you're lukewarm. He says, whoever therefore intends to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of Elohim. You see the mindset? This is again with that whole enmity thing. This whole enmity thing. Or do you think that the scripture speaks to no purpose? Does the spirit which dwells in us intensely crave unto envy? But he gives greater favor because this he says, Elohim resists the proud but gives favor to the humble. See, this is part of the Deuteronomy 8:2 test where it says that he led them through the wilderness or the world or whatever you want to call it to humble them and then to test and prove what was in their heart, whether it was in their heart to keep the commandments or not. But the humbling has to come first, where you realize you've got to subjugate your preferences, I want, I like, I don't want, I don't like, to whatever you say, that's what we're going to do. That's not an easy thing to do. That's not an easy thing. I watch wives struggle with that with husbands. I watch husbands struggle with that with their leaders of the congregations. I watch people struggle with that all over the place in every possible aspect. How do you give up what you want for somebody else? Oh, we're told, you need to prefer others above yourself. Well, what does that mean? I let you get in front of me on the food line at Oneg? Okay, see, I did it. That's not enough. That's not enough. That's no real sacrifice there. He says, so then, verse 7, he says, subject yourselves to Elohim. See, there's the next verse actually says exactly what I was trying to say there. I hadn't even read forward to see that verse, but there it is. He says, you must subject yourselves. You have to subject yourselves to Elohim. How do you do that? You need to resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. I just said all of that, didn't I? How do you resist the devil? Stop giving him stuff to work with. If you subject yourself to Elohim, there's nothing to work with. So he'll just leave. See, we think of resisting the devil meaning that we have to struggle with him. No. Just stop wanting whatever it is that the devil's trying to get you to do, and he has nothing to work with. Because remember, every sin we do it because we like it. I know that sounds terrible. You're not doing it because you hate it. Now, maybe on an intellectual level, you're like Paul, right? He says, that which I don't want to do, I do. But I don't want to do it. But you're doing it because there's another part of you that likes it, that's addicted to it, that desires it, that craves it, so you do it. You stop wanting it and craving it. Look, it's like I've spoken to lots of people that have quit cigarettes, okay? And when they actually quit, not tried quitting, when they actually quit, because quitting is a done deal. You don't tell me you tried to quit. You can't try to quit. There's no such thing as trying to quit. Trying to quit is what people do when they really don't want to quit. So you try to quit, hoping it'll work even though you really don't want to do it. Quitting is quitting. I'm done. Finished. I quit. That's it. Don't tell me you're trying to quit. What trying to quit means I'm still struggling with really not wanting to do what I really want to do. I'm struggling with myself. And I'm hoping that while trying to quit, I'll kind of get to the place where I'm really wanting to quit. You're trying to quit because you know that you're supposed to, but you still don't want to. So you're trying. And almost every one of you knows that when you've tried to quit anything, it almost never works because you don't want to. But if you could actually quit whatever it is that Hasatan's been playing with, he's got nothing to work with. When you quit wanting it, when you quit liking it, when you quit desiring it, when you quit craving it, he can't do anything. Because remember, he's the one on the shoulder, like in the old movies, going, come on now, yeah, it's great, go ahead and do it. Oh yeah, you'll love it, it's the best. He's not the one that said to you, hey, I got an idea, why don't you go do this? No, he already knows you have the idea. And so, by the way, that's why he doesn't do to you what he does to me, or what he does to you, what he does to him or her, because you have your own different things. And so he's going to be cheering you on your thing. And by the way, if the person sitting next to you doesn't have the same thing, he never bothers them about that issue at all. And some of you are frustrated when you have friends who are like, how come my friends never struggle with this, but I do? Because it's what you want, not what they want. You like it, you crave it, you desire it, not them. By the way, they've got their own thing they're craving and desiring that you have no issue with. And that's why we have this big problem judging people. How can you judge somebody? You got your own problems, your own issues, just because you don't have their issue and you think you're all, well, I never had a problem with that. Well, but they never had a problem with your issue. Boom, you're back on even ground. So why are we judging? Thinking we're so much better than everybody. Mostly because a lot of the people we judge, their issue is more public and more obvious, and yours is more hidden. And you're so proud of yourself that nobody knows just how messed up you are. I know, you're like, Rabbi, when are you going to learn your better bedside manner here? This is terrible. Listen, I want you to end up in the life part, and somehow you need to have that smack that says, wake up, you're doing what you're doing because you like it. Not thoroughly, you also hate it. That's where the enmity is. There's a part of you that hates it and a part of you that likes it. And so you struggle inside, and unfortunately, the wrong side wins all too often. And so what do? You do what you're not supposed to do. So here he's going to explain the process to you. He says, subject yourselves to Elohim, resist the devil, and he shall flee from you. Now he's going to give you the process. Now, draw near to Elohim, because guess what? When you're doing that stuff you shouldn't do, you're distancing yourself. Because it's the only way you can do it is to distance yourself. You don't want him to see, like he doesn't see. Oh, but you're convinced yourself that he doesn't see. He says, draw near to Elohim. How do you draw near to Elohim? By doing what he says to do, by obedience. And he says, and he'll draw near to you. He says, cleanse hands, sinners, and cleanse the hearts, you double-minded. And I'm sure as we finally get through Paul's writings, we get to Jacob, we're going to go through this again. But now he's going to give you the process in verse 9. Look, you love and you crave these things. He says, look, lament and mourn and weep. About what? In other words, get out there, just let it out. I know that you still miss your shrimp or your this or your that. Fine. Lament and mourn and weep and get it out already. Just have a good old cry, kick and scream. He says, but let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to dejection. But in doing so, he says, then humble yourselves in the sight of the master and he'll lift you up. It's okay to kick and scream and say, but that was my favorite thing. I love it. So good. Cry about it, get upset about it, let it all go, get humble and submit yourself, and then he'll lift you up. And then he'll lift you up. So this to me, I remember the first time I was reading through this one, it really hit me that, hey, wait a minute. He's talking about getting over the stuff in the previous verses that you love, that you crave, that you desired. The lamenting and mourning and weeping is not saying, I'm such a lousy person and I'm so horrible. No, just say, oh, I'm going to miss all that. I loved it so much. And then just get it out. But then let it go. And then, because he's saying let your joy be turned to dejection, right? In other words, the thing that you loved, let it be something that you've now turned to dejection. Shift. Turn it to your laughter into mourning. All right, so you're mourning over the loss of something you used to love. And, some of you, man, Christmas was it. Some of you it was certain food, whatever it was. Some of you had to give up something that was so big in your life. All right, but you know what? Some of you haven't gone through the mourning process. Go ahead, get it out of your system. It's okay. Don't be embarrassed. Get on your knees, let it all out, and then let him lift you up. Let it go. But you haven't really dealt with it yet. You got to deal with it yet. So what are you in? You're going through that. It's almost like the grieving process. One of the first steps in the grieving process is denial. So most of you are in denial to the fact that you actually have this addiction. Craving, lust, desire, whatever it is that you don't seem to want to let go. You see how this is all a heart issue? All a heart issue. See, because it's not just cleansing the heart. Look at verse 8. It says, cleanse your hearts, you double-minded. So now he's connecting the two. It's not just enough that you're getting your head straight. You got to get the heart straight, because when they're not in sync, guess what you have? Enmity. You know, but you don't do. So what was Paul saying? He was saying, I've got a head-heart issue. What I know I shouldn't do, I'm still doing because my heart's in a problem. And what I know I should do, I don't do because my heart's the problem. My head knows. I got the head knowledge. I know what I should and shouldn't do, but my heart's got it backwards. And so what do? The heart's going to win. It's not enough to know in your head. You can make your head override the heart short term, small periods of time, brief, because you can say, I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to just... But guess what? Over time, until you cleanse that heart out, the heart's going to win. The heart is going to win. Hopefully we understand that. The heart is going to win. Now, let's go back now. Well, hold on. Let me just see where I was. Okay, so you're going to humble yourself. He lift you up. Brothers, verse 11, do not speak against another. He that speaks against a brother and judges a brother speaks against the Torah and judges the Torah. And if you judge Torah, listen to this now, if you judge Torah, you are not a doer of the Torah, but a judge. So he's telling you not to do this. He says if you're judging it, it's only because you're not doing it. And so what do you see? All of the mainstream saying they've already judged the Torah to be no good for you and that's done away with. Well, obviously they're not doing it. And they've turned into a judge. And he says, don't do that. He says, there's one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? By the way, it's the same thing when you judge the law. You judge all these things. Be careful what you do. Let's go back to Ephesians and see if we can kind of wrap this up in Ephesians. And here I thought we were going to get into chapter 3, but we're just redoing chapter 2. Hopefully this is making some sense, though, and you appreciate doing this again. Going through Ephesians chapter 2 again, because I realized maybe I just didn't do a good job with it the first time. So I'm glad that the Ruach grabbed a hold of me and said, you know what? Go back slower and really break this chapter down. Okay. Now we're dealing with verses now 19 through 22 where it talks about, okay, so we're no longer strangers and foreigners. How? If we're dealing with this enmity, if we're now changing our fleshly mind to the Torah mind, we're no longer strangers and foreigners, but we're now going to be fellow citizens with the set-apart ones, not instead of, not replacing, okay? We are members of the household of Elohim because we have been built on the foundation of the emissaries, prophets, and Yeshua. We are being built into the dwelling place of Elohim in the Spirit, in the fullness of how He intended it. Now, my question is, do we know of any issues or concerns related to the dwelling place of Elohim? You know, we're told in 1 Corinthians, do you not know that you are the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, of Elohim? So that goes back to the teaching I did called Follow the Pattern Exactly, which is based on Exodus 25:9, where Moses was told to build the physical tabernacle exactly according to the pattern that was shown to him on the mountain. And of course, my premise of the teaching was, if that was the case, does it not make logical sense that we, who are also the dwelling place, should be built exactly according to the pattern given on Sinai? It seems very simple and logical to me. As well as the fact that it's talking about here in verse 20 exactly that you are members because you were built on the foundation of the emissaries and prophets, Yeshua being the chief cornerstone. So you're built on that foundation. Now, having said all of this, let's go back to the problem in verse 15. Can we see, if you take that little Torah of dogma, commands, or whatever, that little piece out, everything flows beautifully. I'm not telling you to take it out. I'm just telling you that whatever you understand that to mean, and I can go through all kinds of guesses and justifications, but we don't know. Paul doesn't tell us. And it really isn't something that's talked about very much anywhere else. Okay? And so what we know is that's the problem in understanding Ephesians chapter 2, is that we have been taught wrong what that means. I don't know what it does mean, but I can tell you what it can't mean. It can't mean that somehow the Torah was the problem. I think we can see very clearly that it's a mindset, it's an approach, it's the world and Hasatan versus Elohim. It's the way the law of flesh, of sin and death, like Paul talked about in Romans, versus the law of life. The law wasn't the problem. You and how you dealt with it or didn't deal with it. Remember, the contrast was in the beginning in chapter 2, in the beginning of chapter 2, you had no Torah, you walked according to the world. And so what did you have? You had death. But then Messiah called you into the truth, into the light, into understanding about the commandments. They bring life. And then you now made a change in what you were following. So that's the law of sin and death versus the law of life. So let's be careful that we don't allow for the mainstream of Christianity's cherry picking of that little piece of verse 15 to justify the law was the problem. Because you take that little piece out, just that little piece, and nothing that Paul says here even remotely hints that the law was the problem. He says that a lack of law was the problem. Can we agree? Okay, so I'm not going to do what a lot of the spinmeisters like to do. A lot of Messianics figure, well, I have to explain because after all, I'm Gnostic and everybody I'm talking to is Gnostic and we need to know. That's that Gnosticism. I need to know, especially that secret hidden stuff. I got to know. I got to understand everything. Why? But I have to. Well, why? Because I'm craving it. I'm desiring it. And you know what that does? That leads you into all kinds of new doctrinal understanding crack, I call it. You know, we need your fix. That newest, latest hidden knowledge is like crack. We're addicted to it. Be okay with not understanding. I tell people all the time, look at the heroes. Did Noah understand when he was told to build an ark? No. Did Abraham understand when he was told to go take his son and offer him? No. Did Abraham understand when he told him to go and leave his family? Initially, he said, Abraham, yep, go where I send you to go. No. Did the people have any idea where they were going when they left Egypt? No. I mean, why is it that we think that understanding is so important? When I say understanding, I'm not saying understanding what and how and when. I'm talking about understanding why. What is that all about? I don't understand it. Do you understand that what Yahweh said was you need to understand that when I speak, you do? That's all you need to understand. And so I don't understand what this little piece is here. I mean, it's got hyphens in my translation, but there's no hyphens in Greek. The Greek doesn't have any punctuation. So I don't understand what he says, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, and then somebody or somehow, look, for all I know, that's an insertion where they wanted to throw in there, by the way, the problem was the Torah. Of course, it doesn't fit into anything else Paul was talking about. So if Paul meant it to be there, I have no idea what it means. Now, I can make guesses, but you know what? They'd just be my guesses. Does that really help you? Well, if you like my guess, maybe it helps you. If you don't like my guess, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does more harm because then maybe you start thinking, well, maybe I don't want to listen to this teacher because I didn't like his guess. So you know what? I'm not going to guess. I'm going to have my own thoughts. I'm just not going to share them with you because you know what? I don't think it helps. I think what you need to learn is there's going to be lots of situations like this, especially in Paul's writings. And so what do you need to do? You need to do what I just showed you how to do. Read the whole thing. Dig for the context. What is really going on here? What is he talking about? Well, by the way, if you read the other letters, this is Paul's obsession with all the letters. He's trying to explain the difference between righteousness and sin, between those that started out as Gentiles and those that are of the covenant, and what it means to covenant. He's kind of showing how do you go from one world into the other world. He's describing the two worlds, describing the relationship of the two worlds. This is going on in almost all his letters. And yet somehow, because of certain ways of translating and whatever, and the ways being taught from a pulpit, we come to the conclusion that the Torah is the problem. The Torah is the solution. How do you figure it? Everything Paul said here, I mean, everything he said is that the Torah is the solution. It's what brings you close. It's what makes you a citizen. It is the covenant. Because when you had no Torah, you were excluded. You were strangers of the covenants. You had no expectation. You were without Messiah. So the solution is get rid of the Torah, and now still having the same things you had before, which was nothing, makes you now included and have Messiah and all these other things? Does that make any sense to anybody? So I was in this state over here, and to be in this other state over here, the problem is this law thing that actually defines that I was actually where I was. So let's take that away so now I can still stay over here, but now I'm going to be treated like I'm over here. Really? How does that work? It's like saying that the only reason you can't have the job you want is because you need to have, let's say, a doctor degree or a law degree or something. And so let's take that degree thing out of the way so you could just go ahead and be a lawyer with no training and no understanding, or be a doctor, or be whatever. It makes no sense. But yet we have the majority of the Christian world believing this because the system that they're in is lying to them. Okay? The system there is lying. I do not pick on them. I do not judge them because remember we've taught over and over again, unless he gives you the eyes to see and the ears to hear and draws you, you can't see it anyway. And then we have, also within that context, we have those that are only partially, where they understand some of the Torah and they're teaching some of that. Okay, and we see that a lot here locally because you have the Adventists nearby who don't keep the feast, right? But they see the Sabbath. And so I'm glad they see what they see. There are other groups that see other things, and they see what they see. There are a lot of Christian groups, by the way, who understand the fruit of the Spirit way better than any Messianic group does. In other words, they're so much kinder and gentler and focusing on how we treat people, but they're not seeing other parts, right? So we need to have this fullness of the two becoming one renewed man, where we're walking in the way that we love Elohim with all our might and strength, and we're loving each other correctly. And how do we get there? Well, first of all, we got to get our own agendas out of the way and let the book speak for itself. Amen? All right, let's pray. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Father, we come before you, and we're just very excited about the clarity more and more that you bring us from this dark place that we're in, where we're only looking through that crystal in a dark way, and we're seeing dimly, etc. That, Father, that we're seeing more and more. Help us to continue to walk down the path into the understanding that you give us little by little, that stuff that's clear and that's necessary for us to understand so that we can do, so that we can defend, and so we can teach your ways. So, Father, we come to you now wanting to thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for just being there for us and in your mercy and your compassion, for understanding that we were dead, but yet you called us out of that death and made us alive together in Messiah, that you took us from where we were excluded, and now that we're included in citizenship, that you took us from a place where we had no covenants of promise, and now we have covenants. We had no expectation, and we didn't even have you. But now we have all these things laid out as an opportunity for us. And Father, help us to not squander that opportunity. Help us to truly embrace what you've offered and laid before us so that we can subjugate the fleshly man and submit ourselves to you fully. Father, we can't do this ourselves. We need your help in doing it. But we also understand that you expect us to still put in our utmost and put in all of our might and all of our strength and all of our being into this. And that only when we've done all will you come in there and help us with the part we can't do. So, Father, we just thank you and we praise you and we appreciate you and bless your holy name in the name above all names, Yeshua our Messiah. Amen. Amen.